HMS Ark Royal, pennant number 91, was an aircraft carrier of the Royal Navy that was operated during the Second World War. Designed in 1934 to fit the restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty, Ark Royal was built by Cammell Laird at Birkenhead, England, and completed in November 1938. Her design differed from previous aircraft carriers. Ark Royal was the first ship on which the hangars and flight deck were an integral part of the hull, instead of an add-on or part of the superstructure. Designed to carry a large number of aircraft, she had 2 hangar deck levels. She was used during a period that first saw the extensive use of naval air power. Several carrier tactics were developed and refined aboard Ark Royal. Ark Royal operated in some of the most active naval theaters of the Second World War. She was involved in the first aerial U-boat kills of the war, operations off Norway, the search for the German battleship Bismarck, and the Malta convoys. Ark Royal survived several near misses and gained a reputation as a lucky ship. She was torpedoed on November 13, 1941 by the German submarine U-81 and sank the following day. One of her 1,488 crew members was killed. Her sinking was the subject of several inquiries, with investigators keen to know how the carrier was lost in spite of efforts to save the ship and tow her to the naval base at Gibraltar. They found that several design flaws contributed to the loss, which were rectified in new British carriers. The wreck was discovered in December 2002 by an American underwater survey company using sonar mounted on an autonomous underwater vehicle, under contract from the BBC for the filming of a documentary about the ship, at a depth of about 3,300 feet, 1,000 meters, and approximately 30 nautical miles, 56 kilometers, 35 miles, from Gibraltar. Service history. The message sent to the ship informing her of the commencing of hostilities on September 3, 1939. The outbreak of the Second World War on September 3, 1939 had been presaged by Germany's U-boat fleet taking up positions off the British coast, where they could intercept British shipping. Within hours of the war starting, the passenger ship SS Athenia was torpedoed by U-30, the first of over 65,000 tons of shipping sunk by U-boats during the first week of the war. Ark Royal was deployed with the home fleet in the northwestern approaches as part of a hunter-killer group, consisting of a flotilla of destroyers and other anti-submarine vessels grouped around an aircraft carrier, either Courageous, Hermes or Ark Royal. Carrier-borne aircraft could increase the area search for U-boats, but made the carriers tempting targets. On 14 September, Ark Royal received a distress call from SS Fannet Head, which was 200 nautical miles, 230 miles, 370 kilometers, away under pursuit from the surfaced U-30. Ark Royal launched aircraft to aid the merchant ship, but was spotted by U-39, which launched 2 torpedoes. Lookout spotted the torpedo tracks and Ark Royal turned towards the attack, reducing her cross-section and causing the torpedoes to miss and explode harmlessly astern. 3 F-class destroyers escorting the carrier began to depth charge U-39, and forced her to the surface. The German crew abandoned ship before U-39 sank, the first U-boat lost during the war. Ark Royal's aircraft reached Fannet Head, which was in the hands of a German boarding party. The skuas unsuccessfully attacked U-30, 2 crashed when caught by the blast of their own bombs. The U-boat escaped after rescuing the boarding party and the pilots of the downed aircraft, both observers had drowned, and torpedoing the Fannet Head. Ark Royal returned to base in Loch Ewe, where she and her crew were inspected by Winston Churchill. The sinking of U-39 was hailed as important to morale. However, the failed attack on Ark Royal, and the successful attack on Courageous on 17 September, convinced the Admiralty it was too dangerous to risk aircraft carriers in this way, and carrier-centered hunter-killer groups were abandoned. On September 25, 1939, Ark Royal helped rescue the submarine Spearfish, which had been damaged by German warships off Horn Reefs, in the Kattegat. While returning to port with Spearfish and the battleships Nelson and Rodney on 26 September, the ships were located by 3 Luftwaffe Dornier Du-18 seaplanes. Ark Royal launched 3 Blackburn skuas to disperse them. 1 Dornier was shot down in an event propagandized as first British aerial kill of the war. Later it was learned that the pilot of a ferry battle achieved the first kill. The air commander aboard Ark Royal, aware that the surviving Dorniers would report the location of the British ships, ordered the aircraft to be secured and the anti-aircraft weapons readied. 4 Junkers Ju-88 bombers of the Luftwaffe bomber wing KG-30 soon appeared. 3 were driven away by anti-aircraft fire, but the fourth launched a 2,200-pound, 1,000 kilograms, bomb at the carrier. Ark Royal turned hard to starboard, heeling over and avoiding the bomb, which landed in the ocean 100 feet, 30 meters, off her starboard bow and sent a spout of water over the ship. The German pilots did not see if the carrier had been hit, and a reconnaissance flight later located the two battleships, but not Ark Royal. Based on this information, the Germans incorrectly claimed that Ark Royal had sunk. To prove the German propaganda false before it had a negative effect on Britain's allies, Winston Churchill personally reassured United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt that the carrier was undamaged and invited the U.S. naval attaché to view Ark Royal in dock. The British naval attaché in Rome was instructed to assure Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini that the ship was still in service. This was an embarrassment for Goebbels and Nazi propaganda. Hunting the Graf Spee. In October 1939, Ark Royal was redeployed to Freetown to operate off the African coast in the hunt for the German commerce raider Admiral Graf Spee. The carrier was assigned to Force K and sailed with the battlecruiser Renown to the South Atlantic. On 9 October, aircraft from Ark Royal spotted the German tanker Altmark, which supplied Graf Spee. The tanker was disguised as the U.S. vessel Delmer, which fooled the British into passing her by. On 5 November, Ark Royal captured the German merchant SS Uenfels, which was attempting to reach Germany. The ship was later taken into British service as a cargo ship and renamed Empire Ability. Several neutral merchant ships were also spotted by the carrier's aircraft, twice causing crews to believe they were under attack and abandoned ship. A note explaining the situation was dropped in a bag to a Norwegian vessel's crew, and they reboarded. An attempt to repeat this exercise with a Belgian crew failed when the bag was dropped down the ship's funnel. On December 14, 1939, Graf Spee had put into Montevideo to repair damage received during the Battle of the River Plate. Two Royal Navy cruisers followed the raider and patrolled the harbor entrance while reporting Graf Spee's position to the fleet. Ark Royal and Renown were dispatched to join the British ships outside the harbor, but as they were 36 hours away, the British naval attaché came up with a plan to make the Germans believe that the two capital ships had already arrived. An order for fuel for Ark Royal was placed at Buenos Aires, 140 miles, 230 kilometers, west of Montevideo. This was leaked to the press, passed on to the German embassy in Montevideo, and given to Graf Spee's captain, Hans Longsdorff. This contributed to Longsdorff's decision to scuttle his ship. Return to the fleet. With Graf Spee sunk, Ark Royal remained in the Atlantic for a short time before escorting the damaged heavy cruiser Exeter back to Devonport Dockyard, where they arrived in February. Following this, Ark Royal proceeded to Portsmouth to take on supplies and personnel, before sailing to Scapa Flow. On arrival, she transferred her Blackburn skuas to Naval Air Station Hatston to strengthen the anchorage's defenses. Ark Royal was then assigned to the Mediterranean Fleet for exercises, departing Scapa Flow on March 31, 1940 and heading for Alexandria with the aircraft carrier Glorious. The carriers arrived in the eastern Mediterranean on 8 April, but the exercises were cancelled a day later. The ship sailed to Gibraltar to await orders. German forces had invaded Norway as part of Operation Weserübung on 9 April, and had secured sections of the coast. Attempts by the Royal Navy to operate in support of British troops were unsuccessful. Air attacks had overwhelmed the ships, sinking Gurkha and nearly sinking Suffolk. Realizing that the British ships required air cover, but aware that the Norwegian coast was outside the range of British land-based aircraft, the Admiralty recalled Ark Royal and Glorious from the Mediterranean on 16 April. Norwegian campaign. Ark Royal and Glorious arrived at Scapa Flow on April 23, 1940 and were immediately redeployed as part of Operation DX, sailing to Norway with the cruisers Curlew and Berwick and screened by the destroyers Hyperion, Hereward, Hasty, Fearless, Fury, and Juno. This was the first time the Royal Navy had deployed carriers with the primary purpose of providing fighter protection for other warships. The ships took up position on 25 April off the coast, Ark Royal positioned 120 nautical miles, 220 kilometers, offshore to reduce the chance of air attacks. The carrier's aircraft conducted anti-submarine patrols, provided fighter support for other ships, and carried out strikes against shipping and shore targets. Ark Royal returned to Scapa Flow on 27 April to refuel and replace lost and damaged aircraft, before heading back on the same day with the battleship Valiant as escort. During the return, Ark Royal came under air attack from German Junkers Ju-88 and Heinkel 111 bombers operating from Norway. The carrier was undamaged and resumed position on 29 April. A Blackburn skua landing on Ark Royal. The skuas were the mainstay of the fleet air arm during the early Second World War. Also visible are the arrestor wires strung across the flight deck. By this point, the British High Command had realized that they could not hold the Germans in southern Norway. The evacuation of Allied troops from Molde and Andelsnes began, with Ark Royal providing air cover from 30 April. On 1 May, the Germans tried to sink the carrier, with numerous air attacks through the day. Ark Royal's fighters and a heavy anti-aircraft barrage drove off the enemy, and although several bombs were dropped at the carrier, none hit. The evacuations of Molde and Andelsnes were completed on 3 May, and the carrier was recalled to Scapa Flow to refuel and rearm. While in port, Captain Arthur Power left the ship for a promotion to the Admiralty, and was replaced by Captain Cedric Holland. On return to Norway, Ark Royal was told to provide air cover for operations around Narvik, including the landing of French troops on 13 May. She was joined on 18 May by the carriers Glorious and Furious. Despite these efforts, it was clear by the end of May that French forces were on the verge of collapse and Norway was a sideshow compared to the German advance to the English Channel. Operation Alphabet was instigated to move Allied troops from Narvik to Britain. Ark Royal and Glorious, screened by the destroyers Highlander, Diana, Acosta, Ardent, and Acheron, sailed from Scapa Flow on 1 June to cover the evacuation, which commenced the next day. Ark Royal carried out air patrols and bombing raids from 3 to 6 June, before redeploying to Narvik on 7 June. The next day, Glorious, Acosta and Ardent were sunk by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau while heading back to Britain. Ark Royal's aircraft failed to locate the German ships, which had returned to Trondheim. The last evacuation convoy left Narvik on 9 June. Before the British ships could withdraw, a raid on Trondheim located Scharnhorst. An attack by Ark Royal skuas took place at midnight on 13 June. 46. The attack was a disaster. The escort destroyers Antelope and Electra collided while Ark Royal was launching aircraft in fog and returned to England for repairs. 8 of the 15 attacking skuas were shot down, while Scharnhorst escaped damage. Ark Royal returned to Scapa Flow the following day, and was reassigned to the Mediterranean Fleet. Mediterranean deployment. Ark Royal left Scapa Flow with the battlecruiser Hood and 3 destroyers, arriving at Gibraltar on June 23, 1940. Here she joined Force H, under Sir James Somerville. After the capitulation of France, there was concern that a French fleet at Mers el-Kabir might fall under Axis control and tip the balance of power in the Mediterranean, affecting the whole war. Ark Royal's captain, Cedric Holland, had been the British naval attaché in Paris, and was sent to negotiate the surrender or scuttling of the French fleet. Force H was deployed outside the harbour, and when the French admirals refused to agree to the offered terms, opened fire on the French ships. During the attack on Mers el-Kabir, Ark Royal's aircraft provided targeting information for the British ships. The French battleship Strasbourg escaped, despite attacks by swordfish from Ark Royal. 2 days after the attack, aircraft from Ark Royal incapacitated the French battleship Dunkirk, which had been beached in the initial attack. A ferry Swordfish aircraft lands on Ark Royal's flight deck, whilst a Blackburn skua circles overhead. Photograph taken from Calvin after the attacks on the Italian fleet off Sardinia. Having reduced the possibility of a French challenge in the Mediterranean, Force H prepared for attacks on Italian targets, and sailed from Gibraltar on 8 July. The force was attacked by Italian bombers within 8 hours of departing, and although Force H escaped damage, Somerville cancelled the raids and ordered the fleet to Gibraltar. 55. During July, the British colony of Malta came under attack from the Italian Air Force, with Force H ordered to deliver Hawker Hurricanes to reinforce the island's air defences. Force H was deployed from 31 July to 4 August, with the carrier Argus used to deliver the aircraft, while Ark Royal provided air cover for the fleet. On 2 August, Ark Royal launched a successful air attack against the Italian air base at Cagliari. Force H remained at Gibraltar until 30 September, when it escorted reinforcements for Admiral Andrew Cunningham's fleet to Alexandria. En route, diversionary attacks were planned on Italian air bases at Ilmos and Cagliari to direct attention from both the reinforcement operation and a supply convoy sailing to Malta. The attacks were successfully carried out on 1 October, and the fleet reached Alexandria without significant attention from the Italian Air Force. From Alexandria, Ark Royal was detached and sent to West Africa to support British attempts to encourage Vichy French colonies to switch allegiance to the Free French. During negotiations, several Free French aircraft flew from Ark Royal, but their aircrews were arrested at Dakar. Negotiations failed, and bombers from Ark Royal were directed against military installations during the unsuccessful British attempt to take Dakar by force. Ark Royal then returned to Britain for refit, docking in Liverpool on 8 October after being escorted by Fortune, Forester, and Greyhound. The refit, which lasted until 3 November, included repairs to her machinery and the installation of a new flight deck barrier. Next, Ark Royal, accompanied by Barham, Berwick, and Glasgow, sailed for Gibraltar, arriving on 6 November. They were deployed with the rest of Force H to escort convoys from Gibraltar to Alexandria and Malta, performing several runs before being assigned to Operation Collar, one of 35 convoys to support Malta between 1940 and 1942, on 25 November. An Italian fleet, led by the battleships Giulio Cesare and Vittorio Veneto, was dispatched to intercept the convoy. The Italian fleet was detected by a reconnaissance aircraft from Ark Royal, and the carrier launched Swordfish torpedo bombers while the capital ships of Force H turned to meet the enemy. During the engagement, the Battle of Cape Spartivento, the Italian destroyer Lancier was damaged, although it is uncertain if torpedoes from the bombers or British gunfire were responsible. The British mistook Lancier for a cruiser, while the Italian commanders received incorrect reports that the cruiser Bolzano had been hit. 64. British attacks failed to damage any other Italian ships or sink the disabled destroyer, and a retaliatory attack by the Italian Air Force saw Ark Royal as the subject of multiple bombing runs, none of which hit. The battle had no clear result, although the British convoy reached its destination unscathed. On December 14, 1940, Ark Royal and Force H were redeployed from Gibraltar to the Atlantic to search the Azores for commerce raiders. Ark Royal returned to the Mediterranean on 20 December, and escorted the battleship Malaya and merchant ships from Malta until 27 December. Force H then became involved in Operation Excess, a plan to move convoys through the Mediterranean to support the Western Desert Force, which was trying to push Italian land forces from Egypt into Libya. Over the next month, British control of the Mediterranean theater was weakened, particularly by the entry of the Luftwaffe and the near loss of the aircraft carrier Illustrious. The Mediterranean fleet was under pressure from Axis forces in the eastern Mediterranean, while the British port at Gibraltar was likely to be lost if the Spanish chose to ally with the Germans instead of remaining out of the war. To relieve the Mediterranean fleet, while demonstrating British strength to the Spanish, the Admiralty and Admiral Cunningham planned to use Ark Royal Swordfish bombers in raids against Italian targets, supported by bombardment from heavy fleet units. The first bombing, on 2 January against the Tirso Dam in Sardinia, was unsuccessful, 68, but Ark Royal Swordfish bombers were more successful on 6 January, when they bombed the port city of Genoa. The carrier's aircraft also covered the battlecruiser Renown and battleship Malaya while they shelled the port. On 9 January, Ark Royal launched aircraft to bomb an oil refinery at La Spezia, and to lay mines in the harbor. Both operations were successful. Searching for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. In early February 1941, the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau headed into the Atlantic during Operation Berlin on the orders of Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy. They were to disrupt Allied shipping and draw capital ships from other areas. On 8 March, Force H and Ark Royal were ordered to the Canary Islands to search for the battleships, and to cover convoys crossing from the United States. Ark Royal used her aircraft to search for captured ships returning to Germany under the control of prize crews. 3 ships were located on 19 March, 2 scuttled themselves, while the third, SS Polycarp, reached France. On the evening of March 21, 1941, a ferry Fulmer from Ark Royal stumbled across Scharnhorst and Gneisenau at sea. Because of a radio malfunction, the crew had to return to Ark Royal to report, by which time the German ships had escaped under fog. The next day, Ark Royal re-established air patrols in the hope of relocating the raiders. During the day, a catapult malfunction destroyed a ferry Swordfish, flinging the fuselage into the sea ahead of the carrier. Unable to stop, Ark Royal ran over the Swordfish and was overhead when the aircraft's depth charges detonated. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau reached Brest without British harassment, while Ark Royal returned to Gibraltar for repairs, arriving on 24 March. Malta convoys and Operation Tiger. Ark Royal at sea with the battlecruiser Renown. An intense anti-aircraft barrage is visible during an attack by Italian torpedo bombers on Force H. Ark Royal is on the left, with an Italian aircraft over her bows, and HMS Renown to the right. Ark Royal spent April alternating between covering convoys and delivering aircraft to Malta and forays into the Atlantic to hunt commerce raiders. By May 1941, Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps were driving through North Africa towards the Suez Canal, pushing the Western Desert Force before them. With British forces close to collapse and strategic locations threatened, the British High Command risked sending a reinforcement convoy across the Mediterranean to Alexandria. The convoy consisted of 5 large transport ships, escorted by Ark Royal, the battlecruiser Renown, the battleship Queen Elizabeth, the cruisers Sheffield, Naiad, Fiji, and Gloucester, and screened by destroyers of the 5th Destroyer Flotilla. Prior to Ark Royal's departure, Captain Holland left to recuperate from stress and poor health, and was replaced by Captain Loban Mond. The convoy left Gibraltar on 6 May, and was detected by Italian aircraft. The convoy, limited to 14 knots, 26 km per hour, 16 miles per hour, and escorted by so many capital ships, was such a tempting target that Italian and German aircraft were mobilized. The British convoy came under air attack on 8 May, first by the Italian Air Force, then the German Luftwaffe. Over the day, 12 of Ark Royal's ferry Fulmars, the maximum number available, drove off over 50 aircraft, with the assistance of targeting information from Sheffield's radar and anti-aircraft fire from the escorts. During the initial waves, 1 Fulmar was lost, killing Flight Lieutenant Rupert Tillard and Lieutenant Mark Somerville. Another was destroyed with the aircrew recovered, while several others were damaged. Consequently, only 7 were able to face the main Luftwaffe force of 34 aircraft, while an attack just before dark was driven off by 2 aircraft and heavy fire from the ships. The convoy survived without serious damage. The only casualties were to mines, with the Empire Song sunk and New Zealand Star damaged but able to reach port. Ark Royal underwent another aerial attack on 12 May, during her return to Gibraltar. Later that month, she and fellow aircraft carrier Furious delivered Hawker Hurricanes to support Malta. Hunting the Bismarck. See also, Last Battle of the Battleship Bismarck. On May 18, 1941, the German battleship Bismarck and heavy cruiser Prince Eugene began Operation Rheinübung, by breaking into the Atlantic to raid shipping. After sinking the battlecruiser Hood and damaging the battleship Prince of Wales during the Battle of the Denmark Strait, Bismarck shook off her pursuers and headed for the French Atlantic coast. Ark Royal, Renown, and Sheffield, accompanied by Faulkner, Foresight, Forrester, Fortune, Foxhound, and Fury, were dispatched to the Atlantic on 23 May to search for the battleship. On 26 May, a swordfish from Ark Royal located Bismarck and began to shadow her, while the home fleet was mobilized to pursue. One of Ark Royal's ferry Swordfish returns at low level over the sea after making a torpedo attack on Bismarck. At the time of detection, the British ships were 130 nautical miles, 240 kilometers, 150 miles, away and would not catch Bismarck before she reached St. Nazaire, putting her safely under the air cover of the Luftwaffe once in range and while being repaired at the Normandy dry dock. 15 Swordfish bombers were armed with torpedoes and sent to delay the ship. Sheffield, also shadowing Bismarck, was between Ark Royal and Bismarck. The aircraft mistook the British cruiser for their target and fired torpedoes. The torpedoes were fitted with unreliable magnetic detonators, which caused most to explode on contact with the water, while Sheffield evaded the rest. After realizing his mistake, one of the pilots signaled sorry for the kipper to Sheffield. On return to the carrier, the Swordfish were rearmed with contact detonator warhead torpedoes, and launched at 19:15 for a second attack, locating and attacking Bismarck just before sunset. 3 torpedoes hit the battleship, 2 detonated forward of the engine rooms, while the third struck the starboard steering compartment and jammed her rudder in a 15 degrees port turn. 88, Bismarck was forced to sail in circles until a combination of alternating propeller speeds was found which would keep her on a reasonably steady course which, in the prevailing force 8 wind and sea state, forced her to sail towards the British warships with almost no maneuvering capability. 89. The German battleship suffered heavy attack during the night of 26 to 27 May, and sank at 10:39 hours on 27 May. Escorting the Malta convoys. 6 Blackburn skuas of No. 800 Squadron Fleet Air Arm lined up on deck before taking off. Ark Royal and the ships of Force H returned to Gibraltar on May 29, 1941. Despite the boost in Allied morale from the sinking of the battleship Bismarck, the war in the Mediterranean was going against the Allies. Greece and Crete had fallen to the Axis powers, and the Africa Corps was preparing to launch a final push into Egypt. Malta remained an important stronghold in the Mediterranean, but was coming under increased pressure from Italian and German air attacks, and could no longer be supplied from the east since the fall of Crete. Ark Royal was pressed into service, delivering aircraft to Malta during several supply runs throughout June and July, and escorting the convoys of Operation Substance in July and Operation Halberd in September. Despite some losses, the convoys succeeded in keeping Malta supplied and fighting. The continued Allied presence in Malta was a considerable problem for Rommel in Africa, who was losing as much as 1/3 of his supplies from Italy to submarines and bombers based there. Adolf Hitler decided to send a flotilla of U-boats into the Mediterranean to attack Allied shipping, against the advice of Gross-Admiral Raeder. Final voyage and sinking. On November 10, 1941, Ark Royal ferried more aircraft to Malta before returning to Gibraltar. Admiral Somerville had been warned of U-boats off the Spanish coast, and reminded Force H to be vigilant. Also at sea was Friedrich Guggenberger's U-81, which had received a report that Force H was returning to Gibraltar. On 13 November, at 1540, the sonar operator aboard the destroyer Legion detected an unidentified sound, but assumed it was the propellers of a nearby destroyer. 1 minute later, Ark Royal was struck amidships by a torpedo, between the fuel bunkers and bomb store, and directly below the bridge island. The explosion caused Ark Royal to shake, hurled loaded torpedo bombers into the air, and killed 44-year-old able seaman Edward Mitchell, the only man to die in the sinking. The torpedo punched a 130 feet times 30 feet, 40 meters times 9 meters, hole in the ship's bottom and starboard side below the waterline after running deep and hitting the bilge keel, inboard of the side protection system. The hit caused flooding of the starboard boiler room, main switchboard, oil tanks, and over 106 feet, 32 meters, of the ship's starboard bilge. The explosion knocked out all internal communications and the starboard power train, causing the rear half of the ship to lose power. Legion moving alongside the damaged and listing Ark Royal to take off survivors. Immediately after the torpedo strike, Captain Maund ordered the engines to full stop, but with the communications knocked out had to send a runner to the engine room. The ship's continued motion enlarged the hole in the hull, and by the time Ark Royal stopped she had taken on a great deal of water and begun to list to starboard, reaching 18 degrees from center within 20 minutes. Considering the list of the carrier, and the fact that other carriers, including Courageous and Glorious, had sunk rapidly with heavy loss of life, Maund gave the order to abandon ship. The crew were assembled on the flight deck to determine who would remain on board to try to save the ship while Legion came alongside to take off the rest. As a result, comprehensive damage control measures were not initiated until 49 minutes after the attack. The flooding spread unchecked, exacerbated by covers and hatches left open during evacuation of the lower decks. Water spread to the centerline boiler room, which started to flood from below, and power was lost shipwide when the boiler uptakes became choked. Ark Royal had no backup diesel generators. About half an hour after the explosion, the carrier appeared to stabilize. Admiral Somerville, determined to save Ark Royal, ordered damage control parties back to the carrier before taking the battleship Malaya to Gibraltar to organize salvage efforts. The damage control parties relit a boiler, restoring power to the bilge pumps. The destroyer Lafaurie came alongside to provide power and additional pumps, while Swordfish aircraft from Gibraltar flew overhead to supplement anti-submarine patrols. 102, the tug Thames arrived from Gibraltar at 2000 hours, and attached a tow line to Ark Royal, but the flooding had caused the ship to list more severely. Rising water reached the boiler room fan flat, an uninterrupted compartment running the width of the ship. This forced the shutdown of the restored boiler. The list reached 20 degrees between 2:05 and 2:30, and when abandoned ship was declared again at 4 o'clock, had reached 27 degrees. Ark Royal's complement had been evacuated to Legion by 4:30, with the exception of Mitchell, there were no fatalities. The 1,487 officers and crew were transported to Gibraltar. The list reached 45 degrees before Ark Royal capsized and sank at 6:19 on 14 November. Witnesses reported the carrier rolling to 90 degrees, where she remained for 3 minutes before inverting. Ark Royal then broke in two, the aft sinking within a couple of minutes, followed by the bow.